Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. On today's programme, a British writer and journalist, but a man best known for his relationship with Tony Blair, having worked as he did first as his spokesman and then as his director of communications. Alastair Campbell, thanks very much indeed for having been with us. Of course, it's how you're best remembered because it was such a particular role that you fulfilled, this importance that New Labour placed on the message, on the communication of the message. You were one of its architects, working as you did with Tony Blair from 1994. And I suppose to understand the importance of spin, of getting the message right, of getting it across to voters, one has to cast one's mind back to the disarray in which Labour found itself in the mid-1990s and this election of 1997 that was ahead.
I think that's right. You do have to see this sort of historical perspective. The Labour Party had been losing elections successively, 3 in a row, and I think one of the reasons was that we'd never understood the importance of communicating. And it's not about the media. When you talk about communicating, you're talking about the public, and you're constantly trying to get a message through to the public. And Tony Blair, I think, instinctively understood that the Labour Party had to change in many, many ways. And the whole thing about New Labour was, in a sense, distilling the strategy into a very, very simple message, and then putting that to the public over time. Because the other thing that happens inside the political bubble, where a lot of politicians and media people live, inside a bubble, the public aren't there. In a sense, you've got to make an effort to get out and find the public and reach the public. They're going about their lives, they're going to work, they're taking their kids to school, they're taking their mum to hospital, they're doing all the things that they do. They're not sitting there obsessed about politics. And yet, if you're in opposition and you're trying to get into power, you've got to reach them, you've got to find them. And it's always interesting when I come to France, because I still sort of feel that in France, part of the French political system, and maybe the French public, I don't know, sort of look at political communication as rather a bad thing. But I think you can't have politics without proper communication. Politics, in part, is about communication.
And of course, you had this particular relationship with Tony Blair, and a very fraught relationship with the journalist once he did come into, once Labour did win that election, and you carried on in that role of making sure that the message got across. And there were those who said that, in fact, it wasn't so much that when you spoke, one heard Tony Blair, it was sometimes the other way around. And this, in some respects, ironically, did harm to the image of New Labour as it came in.
I certainly think that we underestimated the extent to which spin, that you referred to earlier, became an issue. I always thought it was a inside the bubble issue. I always thought actually this was just something that kind of obsessed journalists. Journalists were obsessed with me and Peter Mandelson and the whole kind of Labour media thing. And I'll tell you why I think it was. I think it was, we were the party that was meant to be kind of nice and lovable but utterly unprofessional. And we could give the government a run for their money during a parliament, but then come the election, let the Conservatives take over again. That was the kind of, so they would pat the Labour Party on the head and say, look, have a nice little opposition and get ahead in the polls every now and then, but for heaven's sake, don't win. And we just wouldn't have that. We weren't going to live with that quasi-reality that they tried to impose upon the political system. So we were all about winning. In opposition, that is your objective, that's your purpose. You have to win. And I mean, I would accept that when we got into government, we maybe hung on for too long to some of the techniques of opposition. Because in opposition, all you've got is what you say. You can't do anything. You can't pass laws. You can't make decisions that directly affect people's lives. You have to explain. That's all that you're doing. So I think that the media, they've got some cause for complaint, but not much, to be absolutely honest.
Could it also be, though, that beyond the necessity of getting the message right and getting it across, that once in government, Labour also took that a step further by continuing to listen to, as you said earlier, you went out to the voters to hear what it was they wanted, that in a sense politics ceased being about ideology, it became about what the focus groups told you that politics wanted?
No, see, it's interesting, you said we went out and found out what the focus groups wanted. We didn't. We went out and found out what people said and what they thought. And I've never quite understood why that should be thought to be controversial, that you go and sit down with a group of people and you really try to find out what they're thinking about things. Now, I can honestly say to you, I don't believe that we let opinion polling drive our strategy. I think we helped it, we allowed it to inform strategy. But by far the most important thing in all that was actually political instinct. So Tony Blair and New Labour, the importance of modernisation and the determination to change the Labour Party as a way of winning the trust of the people and then hopefully change the country, which I think we did, and for the better. It was about communication, but there was a reality there, and the reality was ultimately far more important than the communication. You see, and you said, you know, I think the media in part made me a bigger figure as a way of undermining Tony Blair, sort of saying he can't really do it without these people around him telling him what to do and telling him what to say. But Tony Blair was very much the driver of modernisation of the Labour Party.
Now, on what Tony Blair actually did, of course, in many respects, in those first few years, yours was an easy job. He was a charismatic leader, full of charm. He'd won this landslide victory with this, therefore, the mandate to change things.
It was never easy, though. It was never easy.
Even at the beginning?
No, even at the beginning. Even at the beginning. It's true we had a big majority. We had a landslide. It's true we had an enormous amount of goodwill. And in fact, Tony, interestingly, in his own book, says that he thinks we should have done more during that period. But actually, looking back at it, I can, you know, I mean, I've published my diaries of that time in full now, and we got a lot done, but there were a hell of a lot of days that were really, really difficult. And I think sometimes this is what happens with big figures who are like Tony Blair and other political figures who are constantly being defined. A sort of prism forms over them. So people now look back and think, oh, well, Blair had it so easy. I don't ever remember it being easy.
Well, what definitely made it harder was, of course, Iraq. In the beginning, you must have seen, as it sort of began to loom, you must have seen all the potential pitfalls and dangers and how this would be portrayed in the media, its unpopularity with the British public. Did you share his conviction from the start that it was the right thing to do?
I did, but you're right that I had a lot of worries. There's a point, I think, in my diary on the day of the vote in Parliament, where I say that we all had our doubts, but if he had them, he was hiding them even from us. So, and I think I was talking to some journalists today, and they were asking, you know, pretty much the same question. And the point is that sometimes politicians do have to make really, really difficult decisions, and they're not driven by political calculation. They're driven by what they think they have to do, and that's what it was with Iraq. And you know, it's been gone over so many times, but I think you'll never get. I've never heard Tony Blair express doubt since.
Do you think that the intervention in Libya will change the way we look back at Iraq?
I don't know. I think it's a very different thing, and the scale of the intervention is different as well. And again, I think that David Cameron's now Prime Minister, Barack Obama's president, Nicolas Sarkozy's president of France. These are the guys now making very, very difficult decisions, and it's been interesting to have been very close to a politician making very difficult decisions, and now seeing a different group of politicians wrestling to some extent with some of the same issues in the background, but then the expression of them is very, very different. Gaddafi is a very, very interesting case in point where Tony Blair took a judgment that actually it was possible to get Gaddafi to a different place, and it led to Libya giving up their weapons of mass destruction program. But ultimately, what you've seen recently is, if you like, the old Gaddafi that Tony Blair and others tried to change by dealing with him, by engaging with him. And this new generation of political leadership has had to address it in the way that they've done. I think Libya, in a sense, as an issue, stands or falls on its own. The decision that they make, and they now have to see it through, and they'll get judged on it.
Now, of course, as you say, you're in this position now of having been close to power and the workings of power relatively recently, and now you're in Paris, for instance, to advise the socialists on how to get their act together ahead of 2012 to see what lessons can be brought. You must look at the Labour Party in Britain now and have all sorts of advice for it.
Well, I'm still involved to some extent. I mean, I still see, you've got to remember that the people who are now leading the Labour Party, you know, I've worked with them for years, and so, I mean, I've always been clear since I left in 2003. I went back for both elections, 2005, which we won, 2010, which we didn't. But I don't want a full-time position in politics. I just don't. I've just made that decision. But I'm still involved and I still see people. And I never quite know when advice is advice and when it's a conversation. I just think that if you've been through the sort of experience that I've been through with Tony Blair and with Gordon Brown, you do develop a lot of experience, you do develop a lot of insight. Some of it may be useful to other people.
And having been through that cycle from 1994 onwards, what do you see ahead? I mean, is Ed Miliband someone who can bring Labour back to power?
I think he is, and I certainly hope he is. I mean, I didn't vote for him. I voted for his brother. I was surprised that Ed won, but he did win. And I'm a very loyal tribal Labour person, so I'll support Ed Miliband. And I think that the British politics is in an interesting position because if I'm being absolutely frank about the political backdrop to the last election, David Cameron should have walked it. Economy, difficult. Expenses, scandal. Dominating the Parliament. Gordon, I think even his friends would admit, not as popular as Tony Blair had been at the height of his powers. Lots of difficult issues. The media had turned absolutely vicious against Gordon and the Labour Party and were very soft on Cameron. He didn't get a majority. Now, having got him into government with the coalition with the Liberal Democrats, he's doing all sorts of things which he actually doesn't have a mandate for, a lot of them, and which I think are building up an awful lot of difficulties. And provided the Labour Party regroups after defeat, which you always have to do, understands some of the reasons why we lost, and then always understands that the next election is always about the future and not the past, and puts together the programme and the ideas for that future, then I think Labour's in a very good position.
Alastair Campbell, thanks very much indeed for having spoken with us. That's all there's time for in this interview. We'll be back, though, soon with another. Do stay with us.